happens over the next few days, I will say I've been proud to serve you.
Tonight, with a grand entry in Vancouver, the race is on at the AFN Summer Assembly to see who will be the next National Chief. Good evening, I'm Brittany Hobson. The Assembly of First Nations Summer Assembly began today in Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. Joining us live from the Assembly floor in Vancouver is Dennis Ward with more on today's events.
Thanks, Brittany. By the lunch break, 2,466 delegates had already registered, with more expected to arrive throughout the day. Chiefs and proxies from across Canada are in town to elect a national chief. APTN's Chris Stewart brings us the opening ceremonies.
About 400 chiefs from around the country participated in the grand entry at the Vancouver Convention Centre. Nearly 2,500 registrants are in the city to see the election of a potential new national chief. The members of the Similkameen First Nation drum group from the host province filled the large auditorium. AFN Chief Perry Bellegarde took to the stage. He thanked the efforts of previous chiefs. He then touted the accomplishments the AFN has made under his tenure as National Chief.
I'm proud to have led this organization over the last few years. And no matter what happens over the next few days, I will say I've been proud to serve you and the citizens of our nations and tribes. We've been successful in advancing the agenda forward. Monies for education, for housing, for water, for sewer. All those things.
Bellegarde told the crowd of about 1,000 that the AFN helped protect children's rights.
I also look at the landmark ruling by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, calling on Canada to treat our children fairly, to end the institutionalized systemic discrimination, and as well to make sure they get the services and programs due to them.
The chief pushed back at critics who have said the AFN has gotten too cozy to the federal government.
And for those who say that our AFN can't challenge governments because we become too compliant, I also say that's an example of how we can't push them back and win. A compliant organization doesn't bring the government in before its own Human Rights Commission and win. And it's a win for the children. And we're going to continue to push for our children to ensure they're treated with respect, dignity and love.
The day continued with resolution voting and financial statements. The voting for a new chief takes place tomorrow. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Vancouver.
The Indigenous rights legislation framework is a proposal by the federal government. It's supposed to guide all interactions between it and First Nations, with the goal of getting rid of the Indian Act. As Todd Lamoran reports, the issue could have a higher profile.
Russ Diabo is one of the candidates for National Chief, and he believes the rights legislation framework should be the top issue at the AFN gathering.
Because if this legislation passes, it's going to impact our people for generations to come. Even if somebody gets the money to mount a constitutional challenge, we're going to be stuck with it for years if it passes.
But Diabo says a lot of chiefs need more information.
I understand from coming here, a lot of chiefs don't understand this because there's been no analysis. So this isn't even on their radar.
Prime Minister Trudeau announced the initiative this past Valentine's Day. He wants it passed by the time of the next federal election, October 2019. So Crown Indigenous Minister Carolyn Bennett held engagement meetings with some, but not all, First Nations in Canada.
We should take our time because it infringes on our rights and our titles, so we have to take it seriously to make sure that our views and our sovereign nations are better represented and feel more included in processes.
Pam Palmater thinks the legislation is another top-down process being imposed on First Nations.
So long as it's under federal legislation, you can call it the Indigenous Reconciliation Act if you want to, but an Indian Act is an Indian Act is an Indian Act, so long as the federal government's the one in control.
Palmater doesn't see it being finished in 16 months.
So far, there are no provincial or territorial governments at the table talking about this framework agreement. That alone would take years.
We need to stop it and bring it back to the community level and develop it from the ground up, because each community needs to develop their own way out of the Indian Act.
The proposed legislation does not appear to be considering core issues.
We want our land back, we want a share of our resources, and your 5,000 bureaucrats that manage our lives, you just transfer those funds to us and we'll have our own bureaucracies and our own governments. I don't know how much more complicated you need to make it.
Ayabo says the opt-out option for the legislation is misleading.
My experience for the past 30 years is when they say something's optional, the government makes it the only option in the end.
APTN attempted to get incumbent National Chief Perry Bellegarde's perspective on this issue, but he was not available. Todd Lamrand, APTN National News, Vancouver.
For more complete coverage from the Assembly of First Nations election in Vancouver, you can go to our website, aptnnews.ca. And now we go to our reporter, Amber Bernard, who has been following two of the candidates today. She shares with us what they had to say. Amber, what did you find?
Thank you, Dennis. I was able to interview a couple of the candidates today, one being Russ Diabo, and he's a really interesting candidate. He's been campaigning from the ground up, and he says he's coming from a grassroots mentality, and he's readily challenging AFN's current structure. He's also been saying from the start that AFN needs to change its current relationship with both the federal and provincial governments.
Well, I have lots of support from the people, the grassroots. I have some support from the chiefs. I don't know if I have the 60% needed to win. That's what I have to try and convince the majority of the chiefs here, that they need to choose between Ottawa or the people. You know, I represent the people and the land in my approach. The rest of them are really, like I said, status quo.
Another unique candidate is Catherine Whitecloud. AFN has yet to see a female leader rise to power, but they have some really strong female leadership competing at this year's election. Whitecloud says she wants to bring AFN back to the communities and revitalize traditional leadership and spirituality, something she says is missing from the AFN.
AFN is missing spiritual leadership, and that's what our elders say, because when you're not grounded in your language and you're not attached to the land, and when you're not grounded in who you are as a person, then your leadership, your vision is missing, and we don't have a clear, powerful vision to lead us forward like our ancestors of old did, that we could look back to.
There is a dark horse in this race for National Chief. Miles Richardson believes in setting aside the Indian Act and says the current National Chief is not pushing self-government hard enough. Rob Smith has more.
The consensus here in Vancouver is that it's the National Chief's election to lose. Perry Bellegarde is the favorite. However, some are starting to think that maybe Miles Richardson has a shot. One BC chief told me he'll be supporting his fellow BCer. Despite concerns, his platform is 20 years out of date. Another northern chief told me that he's inclined to keep the status quo and vote Bellegarde, but could change his mind if the BC chiefs make a strong, united push to support Richardson. Richardson himself says the only way forward for the AFN is to go backwards towards its roots.
Well, the AFN is too much, acts like a government for Indigenous people. It has no mandate, no authority to act as a government for our people. Our nations, the leadership in our nations are the representatives of our treaty rights holders, our rights and title holders, and they're accountable to their own people. The AFN has an important role to play, an important leadership role to play, but that's supporting each nation in their territories and bringing our people together in alliance across this country. It's an important role.
As the race for the AFN's top job heats up, APTN's Tina House brings us the latest from the gathering in Vancouver.
Grand Chief Sheila North from Manitoba says that when she was just a little girl, she never would have imagined she'd be here right now, running for National Chief, but says she was influenced by greatness at a young age.
The earliest childhood memory I have is Elijah Harper coming to my house, talking to my dad, and my dad was a chief at the time, and they talked about politics. That's my earliest childhood memory, and I suppose that made an impression on my soul and my spirit that brought me here.
Grand Chief North is running against incumbent Perry Bellegarde, Russ Diabo, Miles Richardson, and Catherine Whitecloud. If she is elected, she will be the first woman in history to lead the Assembly of First Nations.
This is about a movement of our people empowering our sovereign nations, not specifically about me, and I realize that, and I honor that, and I humbly accept the challenge.
Grand Chief Stuart Phillip has been watching the events closely and says maybe it is time for the old guard to change in Indigenous politics.
Grand Chief Sheila North Wilson is a candidate that is deeply committed to the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples across this country. And in my heart, I think that we need a national chief that understands the gravity and the intensity of the suffering of the most marginalized Indigenous people.
Pam Palmer says it's anyone's race at this point.
It's really a mixed bag, but I think most have resigned themselves that AFN's probably not going to change too much. It's probably going to be status quo.
The official vote for the next national chief starts tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
The 5 candidates running for national chief are currently taking part in a candidates forum. You might see or hear incumbent Perry Bellegarde speaking behind me right now. Each candidate is getting a half hour to lay out their platform, and then we'll take questions from the floor from chiefs and proxies ahead of tomorrow's vote. So far, we've already heard from Russ Diabo and Miles Richardson. Here's some of what they had to say.
Candidates, from what I hear, all they're promoting is more the status quo, tinkering with the system, doing what Ottawa says, they're hijacking our right to self-determination. It should be us deciding that on the ground. And we can develop alternatives. If I was national chief, I'd definitely be working with the chiefs that support me in developing those alternatives quickly, but also putting a brake to this legislative track. We should be developing that because this is going to affect our peoples, and it should be our people having input into this from the ground up.
I have a very clear picture in my mind. We are at a crossroads. We have an important choice to make. We can choose to continue down the path we're on.
And you can find more on this candidates forum, of course, later on our website. One other thing that was discussed here today by the chief electoral officer was campaign expenses and contributions. Miles Richardson, Perry Bellegarde, and Sheila North all spent a little more than $30,000 on their campaign. One other thing that could be an indication of just how tight this race is was a resolution passed by people on the floor here this morning that says if there's no clear winner by 10 o'clock tomorrow night, we'll be back here on Thursday and continue voting then. For now, we'll send it back to Brittany in Winnipeg.
Thanks, Dennis. We'll check back in at the AFN Assembly later on. Coming up after the break, Indigenous tourism in Alberta is getting a boost. Here's a look at Wednesday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. Mix and 7 clouds and 29 in Charlottetown and Fredericton. Showers for Happy Valley Goose Bay and a high of 15. 25 in La Grande River. Cloudy skies for most of Quebec. 27 in Montreal and Val-d'Or. In southern Ontario, thunderstorms and 23 in Ottawa. 27 in Sarnia and Windsor. Some sun in Wawa with a high of 18. 25 in Thunder Bay. In northern Manitoba, 19 in Churchill, Thompson, and the Pas, 21 in Brandon, overcast and 20 in Winnipeg, a bit of sun in Saskatoon and North Battleford with a high of 20, 19 in Meadow Lake, 24 and under the sun on Wednesday in Uranium City. There's been another resignation at the National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Melody Casella was manager of health services and a family member. Her role was to make sure survivors and family members received support while testifying. She also testified about her cousin Cheryl Ann Joe, who was murdered on Vancouver's downtown east side in 1992. Casella is the 25th person to leave since the inquiry was formed in 2016. In the Yukon, a proposed change to a 100-year-old mining act could give First Nation governments there more control over who and where people can stake a claim. But the territory's mining industry is not pleased with the move. For over a century, anyone that wanted to stake a mining claim in the territory could do so anywhere. The changes would allow Yukon First Nations to have a say in deciding who can stake claims in certain areas or on their traditional territory. The Yukon Chamber of Mines says the changes could hurt the mining industry.
The free entry system as we know it gives anybody, you, me, First Nations, non-First Nation, young, old, or international for that matter, the opportunity to be able to go out and find Yukon's next mother lode. This kind of system would be an exclusive system where people would be selected in order to be able to do that kind of work. And so that's certainly problematic and concerning for our membership, of which prospectors represent at least more than 100 members.
The province of Alberta has given a $315,000 grant to form a new association, Indigenous Tourism Alberta. The announcement was made on Tsuut'ina Nation near Calgary. The money will support Indigenous entrepreneurs who want to create their own tourism businesses in their communities. It would also add to visitor spending in the province, which brings in over $8 billion a year.
The advantage that Alberta has is the Indigenous communities are very diverse. What's here on Tsuut'ina Nation and the culture is different than what you would find with the Dene in the north or the Métis, and that's actually a market advantage.
Last winter, APTN brought you to the Arctic Ocean by way of a brand new 137-kilometer highway through the Yukon. Charlotte Morg-Jacobs revisited the drive up there recently to see how the road has impacted tourism this summer.
Remember this? The Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway opened November 2017. It connects Canada coast to coast to coast, and for the Northwest Territories, it's a big deal. Fast forward to now. The $300 million Inuvik to Tuk Highway does not handle wet conditions all too well. It's been closed a few times this year, but when it's open like today, nothing stops tourists from going to Tuk. It's only 5 degrees out today, and we meet up with one of the brains behind tourism in Tuk. Annie Steen says she's already seeing more money flowing into her hometown's economy.
It's the locals, they're able to buy more groceries for their families and, not struggle so much because right now and in the near future, there's going to be no offshore development with the moratorium that's been placed on us from the Liberal government, so there's no big dollars that are going to roll into town with big jobs.
Steen says the hamlet is expecting 10,000 tourists this year alone.
And the tours never really came off the bus and mingled with the people, so when they started arriving and staying at the point, everybody just loved it because they could interact and hear where they're from. The people in the community are really curious of where all these people are coming from and why they think Tuk, why Tuk.
And tourism is up. The Pingo market is full of homegrown craft makers like Diane Nazagalowik.
It's good. It's nice to see new people, and right now they're doing good with the Pingo market, and they have tourists at the point, which is good, right by the ocean.
Willing to buy her wares? These tourists from Colorado.
It feels welcoming. People are happy to see us, happy to talk with you.
We were surprised at all the colors of the houses, which is really nice. The ocean is very surprising to see it kind of off color for the season.
Business workers say they see the spike and hope more can be done to accommodate tourism.
I think there should have been stuff done before our highway has opened, but then it just happened so fast, right? Then, we need hotels and maybe more restaurants and, local artists that can contribute their art to the people that's coming to Tuk, traditionally.
Prior to the all-weather road, a one-way plane ticket from Inuvik to Tuk would run you $220. According to Steen, the highway is welcomed by locals.
What I'm hearing a lot is the elders are really happy that the kids can come home at an affordable rate so they get to see their kids more often.
This is the point. You can't go any farther north by car anywhere in the continent. Kelly Oviawik is drying fish.
And they tend to come wanting to try our traditional foods. So fresh fish, they ask me where it's from, I tell them it's from the net. And they're really happy for fresh fish because they say that a lot of them get a lot of frozen fish all the time. So that's one thing, is the dry fish.
Oviawik says that he has spoken with up to 50 tourists in one day. It goes to show that even in 5-degree weather, for tourists, Tuk isn't a middle point. It's a destination. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Tuktoyaktuk.
Time for another quick break, but stick around. We're headed back to the AFN Assembly in Vancouver after these messages. Here's the rest of Wednesday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. A mix of sun and clouds in 24 in Peace River and Grand Prairie. A high of 22 in Edmonton, Red Deer and Lethbridge. A warm day for parts of BC, sunny and 30 degrees in Bella Coola and Quesnel. 29 in Smithers, cloudy and 31 above in Fort Nelson. The heat wave continues in the Yukon, 30 in Beaver Creek, 31 in Dawson. Over to the NWT, a scorching 32 in Trout Lake, Fort Liard and Norman Wells. 28 for Colville Lake, a high of 9 in Sax Harbor. Sunny skies in Nunavut, 27 in Whale Cove, 25 in Chesterfield. Arctic Bay hovering at 2 degrees on Wednesday, and Resolute at 3. Thanks for sticking around. Dennis Ward joins us again from Vancouver, where the AFN Summer Assembly is taking place. Dennis, we've already heard from all of the candidates, all 5 candidates today, but what are you hearing down there? Are there, a front runner, anyone kind of coming up from behind? What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, as you can likely hear, we're hearing some drumming right now as Sheila North is about to make her platform speech. Incumbent Perry Bellegarde just wrapped up his. And then they'll start taking questions from the floor ahead of what's going to be a big day down here tomorrow, big decision for those that will be voting for National Chief. It's also going to be a big day for APTN after tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central. We'll be doing a special live 1-hour edition of In Focus. We'll speak with some of the youth AFN representatives. We'll have Pam Palmater on and Tim Fontaine as well. And then tomorrow night, we'll, after you're wrapped up with the news, we're going to be having a special half-hour newscast where we potentially will have a winner to announce to you and hopefully have that winner here, or we could be waiting for another vote to take place. Also should make mention on Thursday, there'll be a special edition of Nation to Nation with Todd Lamarant.
Hey, thanks again, Dennis. That's all the time we have today, and that's your APTN National News for Tuesday. Stick around. A special edition of APTN's The Laughing Drum is up next from the AFN Assembly.
As we are in the territories of Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam Nations, we are being accompanied by gannetry with the hand drum.